that's kind of weird.
We don't say mammal when we're about to buy, chicken or...
No, but this is what you're saying it is. It's sort of saying cow-shaped mammal is what's in the tin, but after that, no idea.
It is really, really astonishing that this information is not provided to consumers.
Ocean Calls.
Hello and welcome to Ocean Calls. I'm Euronews science reporter Jeremy Wilkes, and today we are talking about traceability. We're asking, where is your fish from and is it really what you think it is? And to discuss this issue, I'm joined by Vanja Wilperhorst from Oceana. She's actually already been on our podcast before. Check out the episode called Is It Okay to Eat Fish If You Love the Ocean? Hi, Vanja.
Hi, Jeremy. Good to see you again.
Very nice to see you too. And Francois Monnier from Planet Tracker, whose work is focused around a concrete plan of action for companies to achieve better sustainability. Hello, Francois.
Hi, Jeremy. Nice to see you.
Thanks for being with us. I've got a bit of an icebreaker question, which our producers have thought up, and I've been thinking about my answer to this one. It is, have you ever been in a situation where you're at a restaurant or you're at home and you're eating some fish, and you start to think that there might be something fishy about this fish, that it might not actually be the product that you think you bought. It actually might be something else. Have you ever had a moment like that? Are you enough of an expert to be able to say, I don't actually think this is that kind of fish. I think it actually might be that. Vanja.
Yes, actually, I've had this experience because we purposefully tried to find mislabeling of seafood products. So we're based in Brussels, Oceana. One of the offices in Oceana Europe is in Brussels. And we did in 2015, so it's a while ago, we tested 250 restaurants, including European institutions, so the European Parliament and European Commission for seafood fraud. So mislabeling of seafood products. And actually, we had to eat ourselves a lot of tuna and cod and hake, which we were sampling. And then it showed how difficult it is to know what you're actually eating if a product has been fried or if it has been processed. And we also, of course, went to some restaurants where we normally might not have gone. And there,
you mean the kind of fancy restaurants where you wouldn't
yes,
normally
sure.
go?
I was really I can explain a bit more about the research if you want, but we had to put a small piece of seafood in a small vial with ethanol, and this was really complex, of course, in a fancy seafood restaurant, but also restaurants that actually normally you would pass by and would be I'm not sure if the fish is good. So yes, there I think we even had one sample which was not. They couldn't identify what species it was. So I wasn't the person who ate that. But yes, I'm happy that...
You were actually able yourself, though, to tell that something wasn't what it said it was? Or was it you had to do the testing afterwards?
No, I think the testing was really, really interesting. So we did DNA testing of all the samples. For some products, you could tell if it was not so processed. So just the skin was still on, or if you saw some parts of the fish, it was not too much cut in pieces, you could still sometimes see I'm not sure if this is a bluefin tuna because we ate, as I said, a lot of bluefin tuna at the time. You could see perhaps that is yellowfin, but it's very difficult to see, especially if it's been treated. So I wouldn't be able to do it in most occasions, basically.
What about you, Francois?
Nothing that crazy, I'd say. But Vanja just mentioned tuna, and I think that's the part that got me always. I might be a little bit too excited about tuna those days because we spend a lot of time investigating that supply chain. And most of the time, if you buy tuna, all it says is tuna. And that's how people conceptualized tuna, right? But it's,
yeah.
I think, I haven't double checked, but I think there might be 15 species of tuna or something like that. And so you basically don't know. Some of them are super expensive, like Vanja said, like bluefin tuna or yellowfin tuna, a little bit less. And some are quite cheap. Some might not be even tuna at all. So it's really, really easy to just say, here is tuna, whatever, you sort it out and you eat it. And so it's, we don't do that for we don't say mammal when we're about to buy, chicken or...
No, but this is what you're saying it is. It's sort of saying cow-shaped mammal is what's in the tin, but after that, no idea, is the equivalent. That's kind of weird, isn't it, to be in a situation like that, Vanja?
No, I fully agree. And the interesting thing here is that for some reason, restaurants have been excluded for requiring information for consumers. So on fresh and frozen products, so in supermarkets and fishmongers, you have information on the species, the scientific name, so actually the full scientific name, where it comes from, and the gear, for example. For, I guess, lobby reasons and also influence reasons, restaurants, mass catering, and hotels have been able to exclude themselves from this requirement when and law was made on consumer information in 2013. And for this reason, there is no information at all when you some restaurants can provide it voluntarily, but there's no requirement to provide this to consumers. And I think for the reasons that Francois also said, and for the complex supply chain that seafood has, it is really, really astonishing that this information is not provided to consumers.
How should a consumer then go about attempting to understand what's on their plate, Francois? What are the steps that they can take at the moment? I mean, we're asking the question, where is your fish from, and is it really what you think it is? Just talk us through the kinds of information that maybe you're not necessarily paying any attention to, but that's out there that you could have access to.
I think as a consumer, it's quite interesting if you just step back and think, you accept to be traced yourself, right? We give our data to technology companies, they trace us. You are able to trace a parcel, you're able to check people online, you're able to basically trace pretty much everything and be traced, but you don't have, I don't know, the ability often to trace or to know where your fish and other food stuff as well, where it comes from. And I think it's a quite weird situation. And so as a consumer, I think all you need from a company really is to know the answer to a few questions, which is what, where, when, and how. What fish, what is the thing that you're actually about to put in your mouth? When is it caught? Because there are some times where people might not know, but some fish species are very vulnerable at some time of the year, so they shouldn't be fished at that time of the year, for instance. How is important as well. There are some fishing techniques that are particularly destructive, some that are actually very little impact on the environment and provide a lot of employment as well, so it's important. And so all of these, I think, this information can be found, because that's our job at Plant Tracker, is to basically help collect all this information and compile it and assign it to some companies. But it's a pain to get all of this information.
How do you go about doing it? Are you phoning people up and things, or are you sending official requests? How does it work?
So I can give you an example, maybe like a practical one. We had a contact with a large retailer in France called Carrefour, and we wanted to check how sustainable their seafood was versus how profitable it was for them, right? The idea being, well, surely if you sell fish that is overfished or not sustainable, it's because there's a trade-off and you make more money. So we were like, let's just look at this connection if you want.
Yeah, it's a kind of assumption that you would make about the way that the market functions, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. And so the way we went about it was signing an NDA with Carrefour, getting all of the financial data, which they kindly accepted to share with us. And then, and this is to answer your question, how do we go about it? We could see what a corporate like Carrefour has in terms of information about their own supply chain, which wholesaler, what's written on the product, etc., etc. And the truth is not much. So then it was about triangulating this information with other organizations, other sources of information. And there's plenty of amazing NGOs out there who help with that work. So for instance, if something says tuna and it's in a can and it comes from one specific part of the Pacific Ocean and it's caught by a specific type of fishing gear, it's very likely that it's going to be skipjack tuna. So it's the type of information that we did.
But you couldn't know the when though of that.
In some cases we could not. Yes, that's very true, because most of the time actually a lot of data was missing. And all of that to say that once you have this information, you can marry this information with environmental health data. So, there are, again, plenty of organizations out there that tells you this stock is healthy, this one is not, this is good, this is bad. And then you can compile a picture, an overall picture. And what we found was actually that this retailer was making lower margin on overfished species. Actually, its lowest margin on overfished species compared to the one that is not, which is, again, I think, very interesting for us, because once you have this type of information, you're able to improve your sustainability, but also improve your profitability. And that can benefit the consumer as well, right? Because then you can change your price, etc.
Why was that happening? Why was that happening then? Why was Carrefour making less on that?
Well, that I obviously can't answer on their behalf, but I suspect there's a lot of market conditions here where, you have to sell cod, you have to sell Atlantic cod, or at least retailers believe that in that case, it was French people want cod and not an equivalent white fish.
Yeah, there's a market that expects a certain thing to be present on the fishmonger's part of the supermarket at any given time of the year. They expect to be able to buy cod, is what you're saying.
Yes, something like that. Or let's say perhaps it is the expectation of the retailers that consumers do want cod and not an equivalent white fish, even though, quite frankly, I mean, I have a child, and when you feed her with fish fingers, I'm not sure she will know the difference between Alaska pollock and another equivalent white fish. I would not notice the difference. So
no, I love fish fingers, and I certainly wouldn't be able to tell you the difference. Vanya, can you talk me through the main figures for traceability and kind of where we are at the moment? What is the situation?
With figures, you mean what is required, or you mean?
No, basically sort of let's say how bad the situation is, I suppose, the situation in terms of like how much do we know and how much do we not know?
Okay, I will try. As you say, like there's a lot we don't know. So Europe is in terms of value still one of the biggest markets for fish products. So this, of course, attracts a lot of imports, because the European production cannot meet this demand. So there is 70% of the fish consumed in Europe is imported. And one of the interesting things here that I was also mentioning before is that there's information for fresh and frozen products, but there's no information for preserved or processed products. So this was also already alluded to. So this is tuna cans, it's sardines in tins. So it's everything that is not a frozen product or a fresh product. So it's 20% of the imports are these products. So basically, what is interesting here is that they also come from often high-risk species, so shrimp and tuna, as we mentioned before, and they sometimes also come from high-risk countries that have been warned by the EU for actually failing to tackle illegal fishing. So here, of the imports, there's a big chunk that is actually coming from low information to consumer and also high-risk fisheries and places, because also, again, for certain species, almost 100% to 95 to 100% passes also through China. So it's processed in China, it's caught somewhere in the world, for example, Russia, it's caught, processed in China, and then comes to Europe. So again,
can you give me an example on that?
Pollock, for example, is an example where a lot is caught by Russian fleet going through China and then getting to Europe. This is, of course,
why is it taking that route?
Because, as I said, fish is one of the most globally traded is the most globally traded animal protein, and also it's just about margins, right? Or trade routes that people have been taking for a very long time. But yeah, I guess the cutting cost is a big part of it. As you know, in Europe, there has been, at least for the catching sector, so the fishers actually in Europe, they have to meet sustainability criteria when they fish in the Northeast Atlantic. So for certain big commercial species like cod, they can only fish some part of the cod that's available to make sure that it's healthy also for future generations of fishers. And also their labor standards, right? They might be different in other countries. So that's also why, for example, these products take this route. It's also about providing fish at a lower cost, and then processing that again in Europe. So here we really see that these processed and preserved products, there's very little consumer information and traceability requirements, because they are excluded for the moment from having to provide information from one part to the supply chain to the next.
And is that simply because it's just so hard to do, to actually be able to provide that traceability, and that possibly it is actually impossible to provide complete traceability?
I think it's also here. It really depends on sort of the company and the sort of what you prioritize, right? Because I think, and Francois can really explain this much better because they have assessed this. But it is the investment that you need to make a product traceable will pay off in the long term, because it also allows you to market your product in a different way. So it also allows you to show that actually you're doing your due diligence. You're making sure that there is sort of checks in the supply chain, that there's no illegal fishing or forced labor. So I think here it's not necessarily a cost. It's also, what do you prioritize? Do you prioritize making profits, or do you prioritize actually making sure that your product is illegal fish free and forced labor free? So there are some companies that do this, but it does require an investment, and perhaps it's also interesting to provide more information on that if you want.
Yeah, Francois, go on. Would you like to talk about that a bit?
No, that's quite interesting, and I agree with Vanya, but with one nuance. So the Pollock example is a good one. Recently, an investigation showed that in China, there are companies that use forced labor of North Korean workers, which means effectively, as a Western company, you fish some fish somewhere in, let's say, the Pacific Ocean, ship it to China to get it processed, but it's a bit of a black box. All you know is that you won't pay much and it will come back processed. Now, when these things happen, often that means it's at a cost to something or someone, right? In that case, North Korean workers. So it's pretty sad. So we have this natural inclination to think that there is a trade-off between profitability and therefore sustainability. It doesn't have to be the case with traceability, though, and which has been the bulk of our work over the past 3 years or so.
What kind of products are you talking about there then, that might be available for me to buy where I live in France, which might have gone through the hands of some poor North Korean who's been forced to work for free or for some kind of very low pay?
Yeah, I would not be able to name, but the investigation focused on the US, but it was about some very commonly available fish that was available in very typical retailers in the US. So and some of these organizations have announced that they cut ties with these suppliers already, which is good. But what I wanted to say is that's a kind of worst case example of the. But with traceability, like Vanya mentioned, you don't have to have this trade-off, right? If you're a company that want to do things according to the law, and that's the overwhelming majority of companies, or at least I would hope, you investing in traceability is actually positive. And the reason is that it's a fantastic way to reduce your cost, right? Why? Because if you know at all time where your fish is, where it's been caught, where it is in the supply chain, who did what to it, you have a massive advantage in terms of knowing what happens, preventing any issues, and therefore that reduces your cost and makes your margin that are quite small, quite low in the seafood supply chain, that increases them. It also means that...
Do you mean, for example, if you've got a problem with a particular batch, then you can trace back where it came from? Is that what
that's
you mean?
one of the reasons, yeah, definitely. So you have a food recall, you know exactly what to recall, and not the whole batch, let's say. And so that's a good example. It also means that there's...
But sorry, I was going to say, when you go to organizations and you talk to them about this, what do they say when you go to big retail chains, for example?
Yeah, so that's interesting. And so there are many retailers who push for seafood traceability. If you look at, there's even a standard for seafood traceability right now, and some of the early endorsers and adopters of these traceability standards are large retailers, which is good. And of course, for them, it makes sense because they are the one who are able to say to consumer, look, your fish is traceable. Sadly, they can't do they can't have traceable fish if upstream in the supply chain, so fishers or farmers are not providing this information. So the reason why some companies don't do it, I think, to be fair, it's a combination of I don't want and I can't. The I can't sometimes is understandable because there's no, if you want, the regulatory system don't, the infrastructure actually is not there for fishers to be able to provide this information. And we actually come up with stats about that, and we found that about roughly only a third of the fish we eat is technically traceable right now. If you think of
really
level of digitalization, level of corruption as well, right? Because if you have a system that say, it's a bluefin tuna, you have to trust what's inside that system, right? So.
And yeah, I mean, as a consumer, you're totally in the dark, basically, aren't you? I mean, as European consumers, obviously, we do well. We've got the EU, which tries to protect us and to help us, and which is bringing in new rules on traceability. Vanya, can you just talk to us a little bit about the situation in Europe and how things are evolving?
Yes, exactly. I wanted also to indeed come back to this, and just also to say in the investigations that were done in China and North Korea. So there was both North Korean workers, but also Uyghur forced labor cases found, and actually they were exporting. These companies were exporting to European companies as well. And the latest North Korean investigation even finds links to suppliers to the European Parliament. So the European Parliament said, in this case, it was not their supplier, but there's definitely a lot of risks for European consumers. And again, here it's coming back to the point that I was making. So it's often processed seafood. So it's, for example, fish fingers, as we were discussing. So here it's again the risk of there's less traceability if there's no traceability required. And this comes to your question, sort of what is changing now. So after 5 years, the EU has managed to have an updated rule on traceability. And one of the really important things is that for imports, there will be more requirements. So the EU already has a very elaborate scheme to check what's coming into the borders, into Europe, apologies. But this information is now by paper. It will be digital. So that means that all products that are coming into Europe will have to be have a digital document that allows member states to know more or less what's coming in, and for control authorities to be able to exchange information. They can now.
When is that going to start to come into force?
So it's in 2 years, in 2026. And now it's already possible. But you can imagine like having thousands of catch certificates arrive. So they're called catch certificates, apologies, catch documents. So it can be a container of fish, it can be like a smaller shipment, but anything that comes into the EU needs to have a document. This will be digital from 2026 onwards. And then also importantly, all products will be covered by this requirement of providing every step in the supply chain with the information. And again, here, this comes back to what we were saying. This is not required for all products. Again, it's the tuna cans that are exempt at the moment. So by 2030, hopefully, if there's a feasibility study that is being done by the EU that is positive, these products will also be included in the traceability system. So for now...
Okay, so that doesn't come in from 2026. It's gradual over the years that follow. Yeah. So, but it will get to the point that by 2030 or so, your fish sticks, your fish fingers, for example, will have the same information as fresh fish.
Yeah. And then again, it's for the authorities, right? So this is, again, the complexity of EU law. So this means that they will be included in the traceability system. So information has to travel with these products from one step to the next. This is available to restaurants. It's available to everybody in the supply chain, not to consumers. So to change this for consumers, it's another law that will need to be changed. Oceana definitely is looking into changing this law, but it's another step. But the good thing is that the information...
So that information will get as far as the Carrefour equivalent, the big supermarket chain, but they are not required to put it on the packaging.
And the restaurants. Well, so this is again EU lawmaking and all the exemptions that exist in traceability. Retailers, so supermarkets, they have to put it on the packaging already now, and they will be required to do the same. It is the restaurants and the hotels that don't have to do this, but they will have the information from 2030. So from 2030 onwards, there is basically no reason to say, I cannot provide this information, it's too complicated, because they will have the information. It's just about figuring out how to put it in an easy way on the menu, or how you treat this to consumers. But honestly, we have 6 more years to figure this out. So I'm very sort of optimistic that we manage.
I was thinking that 2 questions come into my mind. Number one, is it as a consumer going to end up making things more expensive for me because you've got this full long supply chain and this information that's going along it? So there are extra steps, I'm guessing, coming in at some point. And then also, how do you present the information to a consumer who's like me and vaguely interested, but they're really quite hungry and they just like to have their dinner?
Yeah, again, that's going to be a complex answer. And I wish it was simple. So I think what is the key thing is to have at least the baseline, right? And so the baseline for people to start figuring out what they're eating is species. So this is, again, the scientific name. So it will require a bit of help for the consumer to understand. It will have the origin, and it will have the gear. So how it is caught and the origin, where it's coming from. The origin, unfortunately, it can be very broad, but again, this is also about making sure that the information is passed along the chain and then actually is explained to the consumer in a way that is understandable. Then the next question that you asked me is it sustainable? And I think that is, again, not what the new law will change. So the sustainability information will not be on there. So for the moment, it doesn't say state of the stock. It doesn't say the impact of the gear on the seabed, for example. But this information will be on the product. So you can play with that, right? You can make a tool where you can input just the information you see on the package, even on your tuna can from 2030 onwards. And you can have a website that spits out a ranking, for example. And this is actually what the EU is looking at. And they're going to launch a pilot by the end of this year.
Okay. So that would mean that as an interested consumer, I might be looking at something on the menu and then I could maybe think to myself, is this the right time of year to be eating that, or is that stock a threat or whatever? But Francois, to what extent do you think the responsibility should actually be on the consumer? And we were talking about an active consumer, and of course we all want to be active, good students, I suppose, on this. But to what extent should we have a system where we don't need to take that action? In fact, we can just trust whatever's given to us.
I think it's a great question, and you said responsibility. So there's a bit of a moral argument here. I might be more pragmatical, but in a capitalist society in which we are, I think people should think in terms of their interest. That's basically what's happening anyway. And so I think we've talked about why it is in the interest of the consumer to know that, and every other stakeholder across the supply chain, if you want, has an interest as well. So retailers, we talked about it, they have an interest in providing this information. Before that, processors as well. I can expand, but basically it's about, again, having a higher profitability. Fishers and farmers as well. So if you want, everyone along the supply chain has an interest. The regulator as well has an interest, because it's effectively their task to make sure that our oceans are managed, for the lack of a better word, sustainably. And one thing that we haven't talked about, but I think is quite interesting as well, is consumer also equals taxpayers, right? A lot of our tax I was about to say in the EU, but sadly I don't live there anymore. But
you live in the UK.
No, right? Yes. I'm still used to it. A lot of our tax helps fund subsidies that often, it's the case still in the EU, although better than in other places, are called harmful fishery subsidies, right? Because they are funding more capacity, basically driving more overfishing. You could think of a world where some of these subsidies was actually redirected to help all of this traceability, transparency efforts that we talked about. That would not cost us as a consumer or taxpayer anything, actually, because you would just switch some of these subsidies from something negative to something positive. So this again,
so you're switching the model.
Yeah, that would no change in consumer price, and the consumer would know better. So I don't think long story short, I don't think it's in the responsibility of the consumer to do that, but it's the right to know what they eat, simply.
Yeah, I was guessing, Vanya. I mean, I'd like to be in a situation where I don't have to do any research.
Yeah.
But how would you like to see the EU rules evolve then? Because this is now set in place until 2030. How would you like to see it evolve into the next decade afterwards?
Yeah, so what we were discussing before, I think it's really time that all products that are available to European consumers should have the basic information. So this would require changing another law, and this could happen in the coming years. So it's up to the EU to open up this consumer information law and to make it required for all products and for the restaurants and hotel sector. So I think here it's a bit of not of a level playing field in the EU, where small fishmongers, they have to provide all this information, but for some reason it's not required for restaurants and for hotels, who often have the capacity to provide this, especially from 2030, when this information will be available pending the feasibility study. So I think there is a big opportunity for making sure that there's only legal and sustainable fish products on the market. And then on the sustainability part, at least from our perspective, there is really scope to add information in an easy way, right? So that we don't burden the seafood businesses too much, and we don't confuse the consumer too much. But there should be information on if this product is sustainable in terms of the climate, in terms of the impact on the seabed. Is it sort of catching a lot of protected species, and is actually the fish product sustainably managed? So those.
I'm thinking straight away. You mentioned climate. I mean, of course, I love talking about climate change. It's part of my job, and it is a very. And we've talked about it in this podcast as well. The way the oceans are changing it's happening rapidly. The way the fish stock situations changes rapidly as well. I suppose whatever rules you're bringing in have to be flexible enough to evolve according to that as well, right? They have to be constantly updated. That if you're getting a kind of a colour score, I suppose, on whether or not it's a good time to be eating this particular species from this particular place, that has to be flexible. It can't just be set in stone and fixed for 5 or 10 years. Yeah. Would we have the capacity to be that flexible and that agile?
Yeah, so it's complex. I know that European scientists are already looking, because the European Commission has asked them at state of the stock. So basically, is the fishery managed sustainably? And they're looking at the impact on the seabed, which is a bit less complicated, and at are there sensitive species or protected species? Are they ending up in the gear unintentionally? So bycatch. So these three things are being looked at, and indeed, bycatch is turning out to be very difficult. But for the other two, they are advancing, and as I said, they are thinking to launch a pilot where you can input this information, and the website or whatever the tool will look like will spit out sort of a ranking in terms of sustainability on these two criteria. So the state of the stock and the impact on the seabed.
Francois, you mentioned earlier traceability and transparency, which in the mind of a lot of consumers are kind of the same thing. For experts like you, they're not. Can you just quickly explain the difference between those two?
Of course. So probably traceability is about gathering information to know about where a product is, all the details if you want about a specific product. And transparency is about what you choose to do with that information. How much of it do you choose to disclose? Which means that sometimes we hear pushback from companies or fishing companies, let's say, oh, but I don't want to disclose all of this, because then my competitors will know where I fish. And I'm saying, well, fine, you can still have this internal traceability and choose to disclose only what is necessary, which is, at the end of the day, as we said before, not much, which species and where it was caught. With the key difference is that doesn't need to be disclosed in real time, which means that your competitors won't be able to track you down. They will just know that at some.
Is it a very valid concern, actually, Vanya? Do you think it's the fishers are raising that?
I think it's a concern sort of when you look at fishing activity. So what fishers often mention is that They don't like a system that's called automatic identification service. So this is AIS, which is basically satellite information that is publicly available because it's meant to avoid collisions, right? So it's meant to provide safety at sea for the crew and for the captain and everybody on board. Here, fishers raise the concern because of competitiveness reasons. So they don't like being sort of that competitors see where they fish. In terms of traceability, where I think importers have caution is that they don't want to show where they're sourcing, which amazing places they found where they can get their seafood from, which cheap prices they found. So I think here there's a bit of caution there. But as we said, like this is not real-time information. And I actually would encourage any importing product business in Europe to actually make this information available, especially with all the investigations that are coming out showing like we are not involved in illegal fishing and forced labor. You can see because this is where I source from. Check, you can even see the vessel. And it's interesting because some fisheries are like products and tuna providers, so tuna can companies, they do this. You can scan a QR code and it goes right to the vessel. So there are some companies that have invested in this that see indeed that consumers have sort of a demand for not sort of saying verification, but at least some more information to show where the product is coming from, and it is possible. So yes, I think there are some competition concerns, but I think in the grand scheme of things, there are ways to avoid these issues.
And Francois, when you're talking to distributors, to supermarket chain type organisations, to what extent are they kind of really engaged on this topic, or do you need to go through a period of education for a while, explaining your cases about why it's actually more profitable for them to be doing it?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think just being emphasizing with them a little bit. If you're a food retailer, just for your food products, the number of nature-related or biodiversity issues that you need to consider is huge. And often I see that, let's say, overfishing is not competing at the same level than, say, deforestation or social issue, like, I don't know, the one we mentioned before.
Yeah, because I mean, the amount of coffee brands that are selling on their anti-deforestation or the chocolate or whatever, those things are hot topics, aren't they?
They are, and what I push back with is, well, not push back. I would just say overfishing is perhaps the new deforestation when it comes to addressing these issues. I think many people now would say, oh, there's palm oil, I'm not going to buy this. Why would we not do the same with, okay, I know for sure this product is overfished, I shouldn't buy it.
Yeah.
It's the same, right? But this, we're nowhere near that mindset yet. And I think ultimately we will get there.
Vanya, how do we get towards what Francois was just setting out as? And that is a very interesting and I think valid point that will resonate with a lot of people because they probably do make choices like that at the moment in the supermarket. How do we get there with fish products?
Yeah, I think here it's also really about putting pressure on the importers and setting more requirements there, right? Because as Francois said, actually, I think the supermarkets and the retailers they are keen to show to their consumers that the products that they have in their shops are at least sustainable or sort of what the state of the products is that they sell. But here it's also about what's coming in the 70% of imports that we are importing. So I think here, like a big group that we are trying to talk to, but it's very difficult, is the European companies that are importing a lot and then providing these products also at cheap prices to European consumers, right? So I think the retailers, we are already getting there. I'm not saying it's perfect because indeed these investigations show also retailers' involvement of forced labor and illegal fishing. But the due diligence, I think that at least they are aware of it and they are trying to address this issue. Maybe also because of the push on deforestation. But yes, with importers, not necessarily.
But with these European rules that we were talking about, it will take us closer towards that.
Yes, they will be required to at least collect the information. from the fish that they source, right? So this will be also then provided to the entire chain, and the information is there to be used for authorities and indeed for the supply chain. And this is also where a due diligence law would be really helpful. I think they are trying to get one in the EU. So just to say that it is your responsibility as a company in the EU, so it doesn't matter, importer, retailer, everything, to actually make sure that you're not causing environmental damage or human damage, right? And so this law is now, they're trying to get it through the EU, but it's being blocked by the member states. So I think also here it's about the incentives that are given by states. So it's really key that these types of laws are put in place, and then that companies are helped to actually put them in, sort of implement them, and that member states control them.
Francois, do you think we can get to the point where we're not doing damage, I suppose, that we are in a sustainable state?
Yeah, I mean, that's our objective, at least, and I think it's possible, but it requires companies to change, quite frankly, because then when companies understand that it is in their interest to actually change, and that maybe it will cost them in the short term, but that over the long term it will make things better, then ultimately these companies will support more progressive change in regulations. For instance, even in the EU, some retailers were pushing for more traceability. So, it does happen, and I think we'll get there. One thing that will make things harder, but at the same time add more urgency to this issue, is climate change. You mentioned it before, and we've done an investigation in Indonesia. And long story short, showing that the profitability of the local tuna industry is going to be completely wiped out because of climate change. Now, there's not much the industry can do, right? They won't be able to stop climate change on their own. However, the financial impact of that, they will, because they can invest now in traceability or more sustainable ways of fishing, etc., that do cost money in the short term, but in the long term improve profits, which means that they mitigate this impact. And so I think that's if companies were to think like that, and the investors in these companies thought like that would drive change at the consumer level throughout the supply chain, and that would benefit the consumer.
Well, thank you very much, Francois Monnier from Planet Tracker and Vanja Wolperhorst from Oceana for joining us on Ocean Call. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I look forward to living through that experience of transformation as those EU rules come in and we start to see different things written down on the menu in restaurants, and hopefully we consumers can get to a point where we can enjoy these wonderful products of the sea in a sustainable way. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks very much for watching this episode of Ocean Calls on YouTube. One more thing, please head over to your usual podcast app in order to listen to this episode with extra interviews and content on this topic. Catch some surprising facts and hear extraordinary tales of the sea from musicians, actors, activists and even astronauts. This season, for example, you'll hear from sex education actor Chris Jenks and fresh fish-obsessed Dutch chef Bart Van Olphen. I'll see you soon.
Ocean Calls.